A local developer is planning to break a world record with a new skyscraper in Brooklyn.
This will become the tallest passive house skyscraper in the world.
Rising 1,396 feet above Manhattan's Billionaire's Row, 432 Park Avenue once set records. The priciest penthouse in America, the tallest residential tower in the hemisphere. Today, its white concrete facade is cracking, spreading across nearly 2,000 defects, while 2 lawsuits accuse its developers of ignoring warnings and rewriting the sales documents buyers signed. A $160 million repair sits unstarted. A $165 million fraud case remains unresolved. In this video, we trace the material choice, the buried warnings, and the paper trail 2 lawsuits say proves what the developers knew. So let's discuss it all and get to the truth behind the cracks. Where the risk began. Every super tall tower begins with a site, and this one began with a hotel. In 2006, developer Harry Macklowe purchased the former Drake Hotel at the corner of Park Avenue and 57th Street.
Real estate, because it has so many discipline, Park Avenue and 150 72nd Street at Lexington Avenue.
For $440 million, then demolished it entirely. What followed was not immediate. The site sat empty for roughly 5 years, while Macklowe worked to assemble financing for a project ambitious enough to match the location. The breakthrough came through a partnership with the Los Angeles-based CIM Group, whose capital finally allowed construction to move forward on what Macklowe would later describe, in public statements, as a capstone project for his career. The tower that eventually rose there was never going to look like its neighbors. Architect Rafael Viñoly, the Uruguayan-American designer based in New York, gave the building a nearly pure square footprint, roughly 93.5 feet on each side, paired with a height-to-width ratio of 15:1. That ratio placed it among the most extreme pencil towers ever built in Manhattan, a category of super-tall structures so slender that engineering itself becomes the primary design constraint, not an afterthought layered on top of one. Why build something this structurally daring in the first place? Because slenderness itself had become a selling point on Billionaire's Row, where unobstructed views and record-setting height translated directly into record-setting prices. The design decision that would eventually define this building's entire future came down to its facade. Rather than wrapping the tower in a separate decorative cladding system, as most super talls do, the design called for the structural concrete itself to double as the exterior finish. The material holding the building up would also be the material the world looked at. In 2011, the decision was finalized to use a specialty white Portland cement for that exposed structural concrete, a material engineered primarily for its visual appearance under stress, not for load-bearing performance at extreme height. No concrete of that particular color and composition had previously been asked to carry a building of this scale. That choice, beauty and structure fused into a single, unforgiving material, became what many close to the project would later describe as the foundational risk running underneath everything that came after. Isn't it worth asking why a building this expensive, this closely watched, would gamble its entire structural integrity on a material never tested at this height before? The architects were not blind to the risk. Neither, according to later reporting, were the engineers. What they chose to do next, or rather, what the developers chose to do with what they were told, is where this story actually begins to take shape. Construction on the tower began in 2013. By the time it opened its doors in 2015, 432 Park Avenue briefly stood as the tallest residential building in the Western Hemisphere.
The tallest residential building in the Western Hemisphere is nearing completion. With construction work at nearly 1,400 feet, the building is taller than both the Empire State Building,
a monument built in record time on a foundation of ambition, capital, and a material choice that had already, quietly, been flagged as dangerous. The broader context surrounding this project matters as much as any single design decision made inside it. Billionaire's Row, the stretch of Manhattan real estate where this tower rose, had by the early 2010s become a proving ground for a very specific kind of architectural competition. Not who could build the most livable tower, but who could build the tallest, thinnest, most photographed one. That competitive pressure did not exist in a vacuum. Every decision made on this particular site was shaped, at least in part, by the knowledge that a handful of other developers were racing to claim the same record-setting headlines. Few structures illustrate the tension between architectural ambition and physical reality as starkly as an extreme pencil tower. A ratio of 15:1 between height and width leaves almost no margin for structural error, and almost no room for a material choice to underperform without consequence. Engineers working on buildings at this ratio typically favor redundancy, multiple layers of protection against any single point of failure. Choosing a single, untested material to serve as both the structure and the finish removed one of those layers before the tower had even reached its full height. Was that always going to be a gamble, or did it only become one once the warnings started arriving? The record suggests the answer was always the former. The warnings simply confirmed what the design already risked. The warnings they ignored. Warnings rarely arrive as dramatic confrontations. More often they arrive the way this one did, as a single email, sent quietly, easy to file away and easy to ignore. In 2012, Jim Herr of Raphael Vignoli Architects sent the developers a message about the white concrete decision.
Raphael Vignoli, I'm an architect in New York and in many other parts of the world. We've done a lot of work in America.
According to a later New York Times investigation into internal project communications, Herr's email warned that the chosen path was heading toward eventual structural failure and legal consequences. The warning was documented. The warning was, according to subsequent lawsuits, effectively set aside. That was not the only red flag raised before construction reached its final stages. According to allegations in the condo board's later lawsuit, mock-up testing conducted during the design phase showed that the chosen white concrete mix would crack under the loads the finished building would eventually bear. Around the same period, an internal WSP engineering communication reportedly reduced the entire dilemma to 3 words: color or cracks, the building's exterior appearance, or its long-term structural durability. The lawsuit alleges the developers chose color. The consequences of that choice did not wait for the building to be finished before appearing. According to reporting on the lawsuit's allegations, the concrete supplier was still experimenting with different mix formulations months after facade construction had already begun, and cracks reportedly began appearing almost immediately afterward. Isn't it worth pausing on the timeline here? The facade was still being calibrated in real time while it was simultaneously being installed on one of the tallest residential towers ever constructed in New York City.
Tomorrow morning, this will officially become the tallest residential tower in the world.
There was one more opportunity to change course before the building's exterior was fully sealed. WSP engineers reportedly recommended applying an opaque elastomeric coating over the concrete facade, a protective layer designed to seal the surface against water and air infiltration. According to the allegations later filed in court, that recommendation was rejected specifically because the coating would have altered the building's appearance and reduced its appeal to the ultra-wealthy buyers the project depended on. A clear coating was applied instead, one that engineers have since testified, according to court filings, was inadequate against the punishing cycle of New York rain, wind, and seasonal freeze and thaw stress. Every decision in this sequence points in the same direction. Warnings were documented. Alternatives were proposed. And at each juncture, according to the allegations now working through the New York court system, the choice made favored how the building looked over how long it would hold together. That pattern, repeated at every decision point, is precisely what the lawsuits filed years later would attempt to prove was not a series of unfortunate mistakes, but a consistent, calculated pattern of prioritization. It is worth understanding how unusual this sequence actually is within the construction industry itself, rather than assuming every large project involves this level of internal disagreement. Structural engineering firms routinely flag risks during a project's design phase. That alone is not remarkable. What tends to be far less common is a documented, repeated pattern in which every single flagged risk is reportedly overridden in favor of the same underlying priority, appearance, across a period spanning years, rather than a single contested decision. A single overridden warning might reasonably be explained by cost pressure or scheduling constraints common to any major project. A pattern spanning the material selection, the mock-up test results, and the coding recommendation is harder to attribute to ordinary project friction alone, which is precisely the argument at the heart of the fraud allegations filed years later. There is also a structural imbalance worth naming plainly, one that shapes nearly every major construction project regardless of its location or budget. Engineers and architects are typically retained by, and paid by, the same developer whose decisions they are warning against. That arrangement does not automatically compromise professional judgment, and nothing in the public record suggests the engineers here failed to raise concerns clearly and repeatedly. But it does mean that a warning, however well documented, carries no enforcement power of its own. An engineer can put a risk in writing. Only the party controlling the budget decides whether that risk gets addressed or absorbed into the schedule. On a project this size, with this many stakeholders and this much capital already committed, a warning competing against a sales calendar rarely wins on paper alone. From luxury to litigation. By 2016, the consequences of those earlier decisions had become visible enough to measure. A survey conducted that year identified approximately 1,893 separate defects across the building, according to figures later cited in litigation. That number alone is worth sitting with. Nearly 2,000 documented issues, on a tower that had been open to residents for barely a year, on a structure marketed as the pinnacle of modern engineering and design. The building's earliest residents did not need a survey to notice something was wrong. According to complaints later filed by the condo board, residents reported persistent creaking and banging sounds throughout the structure, vibrations strong enough to disturb sleep on certain floors, and mechanical issues affecting the building's elevators. A trash chute reportedly produced sounds loud enough to alarm residents when garbage from higher floors reached the bottom. None of these individually sounds catastrophic. Together, according to the allegations, they painted a picture of a building already straining against the choices made years earlier during its design phase. In 2021, the condo board filed its first lawsuit against the development team, citing widespread defects and seeking damages tied to the building's construction. That filing marked the beginning of a legal battle that would stretch across multiple years and, eventually, multiple separate cases. It also marked the first time the building's internal problems became a matter of public record rather than private frustration confined to residents and their attorneys. Living inside a building generating this many documented issues carries a texture that a defect count alone cannot fully convey. Residents who had paid tens of millions of dollars for their apartments found themselves navigating elevators prone to malfunction, enduring structural sounds that made certain floors difficult to sleep on during high winds, and reporting mechanical failures inconsistent with a building barely out of its first year of occupancy. For a tower marketed around uninterrupted luxury, that daily reality stood in stark contrast to the renderings and sales materials that had convinced buyers to sign in the first place. The condo board did not rely solely on resident complaints when building its case. According to court filings, the board commissioned independent engineering assessments specifically to document the scope of the problem in terms a courtroom could evaluate. Those assessments, cited in later reporting, found that a significant share of the building's mechanical, plumbing, and electrical infrastructure did not conform to the developer's own as-built drawings. The official documentation meant to reflect exactly what had been constructed. A portion of those non-conforming components, according to the same reporting, presented genuine life safety concerns rather than simple cosmetic issues. The gap between as-built drawings and actual construction deserves a moment of its own explanation, because it is easy to underestimate how significant that discrepancy actually is. As-built drawings exist precisely so that future owners, inspectors, and emergency responders know what is genuinely behind a wall, above a ceiling, or beneath a floor, without needing to open it up to check. When those drawings do not match reality, every subsequent repair, inspection.
Tom Nguyen is Deputy Commissioner for Infrastructure with the New York City Department of Design and Construction.
Or emergency response starts from inaccurate information. A discrepancy at this scale does not simply complicate a lawsuit. It complicates the day-to-day management of the building itself. For as long as those drawings remain the reference point maintenance crews and inspectors continue to rely on. What makes this pattern particularly difficult to dismiss as ordinary wear is the timeline itself. This was not a decades-old building showing its age. This was a tower barely out of its opening years, still under warranty in the eyes of most buyers, already generating a defect count that would be alarming in a structure 3 times its age. Doesn't that gap between how the building was marketed and how quickly it began deteriorating deserve more scrutiny than a single line in a real estate listing ever gave it? The Condo Board's 2021 lawsuit would not be the end of this story. It would turn out to be only the opening chapter, establishing a legal record that a much larger and more serious case would build upon 4 years later, a case that would allege something far more deliberate than construction defects alone. The 2025 fraud allegations. In April of 2025, the Condo Board filed a second, far more aggressive lawsuit, this time naming Harry Macklowe, CIM Group, and several architecture and engineering firms directly, and alleging what the filing itself described as deliberate and far-reaching fraud. The board sought $165 million in damages, along with punitive damages tied to what it claimed was a knowing, coordinated effort to conceal the building's structural problems from both buyers and city regulators. At the center of this newer filing sits a single, quietly altered sentence. The lawsuit alleges that the building's official offering plan, the legal sales document buyers rely on when purchasing a unit, was revised in 2013, while apartments were still actively being sold. The original language reportedly stated that the concrete would prevent water penetration. The revised language stated only that the concrete and properly sealed windows had been designed to prevent water penetration. One change, from a guarantee to an intention. That distinction, small enough to miss on a first read, is precisely the detail the lawsuit argues buyers were never made aware of. Why does a single word matter this much in a legal filing worth hundreds of millions of dollars? Because under New York City regulations, architects and engineers working on a project are required to notify the city's Department of Buildings of any immediately hazardous conditions discovered during construction or afterward. According to the allegations, no such formal notification was ever.
The safety vests on any day navigating around the city. The Department of Design and Construction
filed regarding conditions at 432 Park Avenue, despite internal warnings, mock-up test failures, and a defect count nearing 2,000 issues by 2016. That regulatory gap sits at the heart of why this case extends well beyond a typical construction dispute. Most disagreements between condo boards and developers over defects get resolved through negotiated repairs, insurance claims, or settlements that never draw public attention. Fraud allegations are a different category entirely, requiring proof not just that problems existed, but that the people responsible knew about them and took active steps to conceal that knowledge from buyers, regulators, or both. Meeting that higher legal bar typically requires exactly the kind of internal documentation this case appears to center on: emails, mock-up test results, and a sales document allegedly altered mid-sale rather than after the fact. The scale of the underlying legal process reflects that complexity. According to reporting on the case, more than 7 million pages of documents have been reviewed by attorneys on both sides, alongside roughly 100 days of depositions, a volume of legal work more typical of major corporate litigation than a single residential building dispute. That scale alone signals how seriously both sides are treating the underlying claims, regardless of how the allegations are ultimately resolved. Cases built on this scale of documentation typically move through New York's court system on a timeline measured in years rather than months, and this one is unlikely to be an exception. Fraud claims of this size generally proceed through extended discovery, expert testimony from structural engineers representing both sides, and often a lengthy period of pre-trial motions before either a settlement is reached or the case actually goes before a jury. None of that changes what is already documented and part of the public record: the warnings, the mock-up test results, the defect count, and the specific wording change in the offering plan. What remains genuinely undecided is whether that documented history meets the specific legal threshold required to prove fraud, as opposed to negligence or ordinary construction disputes that fall short of that higher bar. The developers and design firms named in the 2025 lawsuit have firmly denied the allegations. CIM Group has publicly described the fraud claims as baseless and categorically untrue. Salsi Architects, the project's architect of record, has stated it vehemently denies the claims and is seeking to have the complaint dismissed. These denials matter, and any fair account of this story has to include them clearly. The allegations remain allegations, tested in court rather than settled in a video script. What is not in dispute, because it exists in the historical record rather than in contested testimony, is the sequence of decisions that led to this courtroom. A material was chosen despite written warnings. A coating was rejected for aesthetic reasons. A defect count climbed into the thousands. And a legal document, according to the current allegations, was quietly edited.
How do I report illegal construction?
Paper the walls of a construction site.
While the building was still being sold to buyers who had no way of knowing anything had changed at all. The billion-dollar question. The engineering path forward, at least on paper, is not a mystery. According to a New York Times investigation, structural engineer Bongiorno estimated that a repair project costing roughly $160 million could seal the facade, address the ongoing spalling concrete, and protect the building's mechanical systems from continued water damage. Bongiorno reportedly warned that without that repair, the building would continue losing chunks of concrete, its windows would begin loosening, and its mechanical systems and pipe joints would continue to fail under sustained water infiltration. Run the numbers, and the scale of the problem becomes clear. The tower cost roughly $1.3 billion to construct. A full repair, at the estimated cost, would push the building's all-in total past $1.4 billion, and that estimate assumes no further deterioration between now and whenever work might actually begin. Meanwhile, unit values across the building have been trending downward since the structural disclosures became public, meaning the very asset the repair is meant to protect has already lost a measurable share of the value repair spending is supposed to preserve. There is also the matter of reputation, a cost no engineering estimate can fully capture. Even a technically successful repair, facade sealed, cracks addressed, mechanical systems stabilized, would not erase a name that has, over the past several years, become closely associated with construction litigation rather than architectural achievement. Luxury buyers are, by nearly every account of this market, purchasing prestige as much as square footage. Can a repaired building fully recover a reputation once it becomes this closely tied to a defect count in the thousands and a fraud lawsuit seeking that much in damages? Buyers considering similarly ambitious towers now have a documented reference point they did not have a decade ago, and that shift alone may prove to be one of this case's more lasting effects. Purchase agreements for super tall residential units rarely include the kind of technical detail an ordinary buyer would need to independently evaluate a building's structural choices. Most buyers rely entirely on the developer's representations, the architect's reputation, and the polish of the sales presentation itself. Whether this case ultimately changes how thoroughly future buyers or their attorneys scrutinize offering plans before signing remains an open question, but it is difficult to imagine the next generation of super tall marketing materials going entirely unaffected by a lawsuit this publicly documented. That tension between the cost of fixing the building and the value the fix would actually protect may explain part of why no comprehensive repair has yet begun, even years after the first defects were documented. Litigation itself tends to freeze major capital decisions in place, since spending on repairs before liability is resolved can complicate a defendant's legal position, and spending on repairs before a settlement is reached can strain a condo board's finances long before any compensation arrives. In the meantime, the tower continues standing exactly as it has for the past several years, its upper floors reflecting the Manhattan skyline at sunset, its lower floors carrying a facade quietly wrapped in a coating engineers warned would not hold. Some units sit unoccupied for long stretches, owned through corporate structures rather than lived in day to day, a pattern common enough across Billionaire's Row that vacancy itself has become a recognized feature of this particular real estate tier. Fawaz Al-Hokair's own unit, listed for $169 million in 2021, roughly double what he paid for it in 2016, reflects a market still betting on the address itself, cracks and litigation notwithstanding. Whether that bet continues paying off may ultimately depend less on courtroom outcomes than on whether the physical building can be stabilized before its reputation becomes as permanent a feature as its concrete. There is a broader lesson here for an entire category of construction, one that extends well past a single tower on a single stretch of Manhattan real estate. Super tall residential buildings occupy a strange position in the construction industry, pushed toward record-setting height and visual distinction by market pressure, while simultaneously demanding the kind of structural conservatism that record-setting height should logically require. When those two pressures pull in opposite directions, something eventually has to give, and the allegations at the center of this case suggest that here, it was the physical building itself that gave way first, long before any courtroom weighed in. Future developers watching this litigation unfold now have a documented case study of exactly what happens when a material decision outruns its own testing, and when warnings, however specific, compete against a sales calendar already promising buyers a finished product. Whether that lesson changes how the next super tall gets built remains, for now, as unresolved as the lawsuit itself. What is already certain is this: the next developer standing at that same crossroads, choosing between a warning and a deadline, will not be able to claim they had no example to look at first. What began as a record-breaking symbol of luxury has become a lasting lesson in engineering, risk, and accountability. The allegations remain before the courts, and only the legal process will determine responsibility. But the documented warnings, the design decisions, and the years of litigation have already reshaped how many people view one of the world's most famous residential towers. For future developers, this case may become the blueprint for what to avoid when ambition collides with engineering reality. In the end, the greatest cost may not be measured in dollars, but in trust. If you enjoyed this investigation, subscribe and join us for more stories hidden behind the world's greatest structures.